And welcome to a mini hoon on the kaka with Matt Nolan, someone who I've been admiring from afar and had good chats with in the past about economics. An economist who was in Wellington but now is in Australia, working for E61, a non-partisan think tank, I suppose you'd call it in New Zealand parlance. Matt, lovely to have you on the kaka. Thank you for coming on.
Oh, thanks for having me, Bernard.
Now, you've got a great Substack, which I'll make sure I link to in the show notes. And it's all about the gnarly issues around um, economies, transfer payments, taxes, all the fun stuff. And Matt, there's a debate going on in Australia, as there often is here, about what do we do with GST? Do we change our income tax? Do we find other ways to make money? Because there seems to be pressures on everyone all the time, and everyone's got a great idea on how you can change a tax. So it's good. So, Matt, one of the issues is GST. So, could you tell us a bit about the sort of debate around GST in Australia?
So at the moment, there's a concern about fiscal sustainability in Australia. So there's been deficits for a while, especially when you take into account state governments. As how do you effectively pay for that? So of course, all the economists say increase the GST. Same thing you'll hear in New Zealand, and the same thing you would often hear from me as well. But things are quite complex here because only about half of consumption is captured by GST in Australia.
Wow.
A lot of things are sort of exempted types of foods. And so you get these gnarly border issues where, something that's fresh won't have GST on it, but if it was slightly processed, it will. And people change their behavior due to that.
So
So
cakes and biscuits are often the one thing you see.
exactly, exactly. But the thing is even though a lot of economists and even advocates, places like the Australia Institute that's very left leaning, have said let's tax some of these items, the government won't touch it. There was a political consensus built up when it was introduced by John Howard that certain items just wouldn't be touched. And I'd rather not think about how to deal with what's called the distributional consequences, the fact that some people might lose out. You might need to compensate them. So it's left untouched, and ultimately policymakers aren't going to do anything. Now, why are economists still debating it? Because there is a belief that having a GST is a really effective way to raise your base revenue, as long as you turn around and say, I am going to make sure that people that have low incomes are supported. I'm going to make sure that people that are really struggling with liquidity in their life have access to liquidity and a way to make their way through. And I'm going to make sure I have systems of support that don't have people fall through the gaps. And that we redistribute if there's excessive wealth or excessive accumulation of income amongst certain people. And other systems will do that while the GST exists. That's the economist dream. And those two have to be combined together.
Yeah, because we've been through a sort of a version of this ourselves back in 2009-10. The first tax working group under John Key and Bill English had this debate. We want a tax switch. What is it going to be? Is it going to be a land tax for income tax switch? And in the end, they came up with the idea of a GST increase offset by various tax cuts and changes to working for families, which was designed to be, quote, distributionally neutral. And I've never actually seen a sort of follow up on that. Was it actually distributionally neutral? Because one of the problems with GST really is that it's quite a regressive tax. If you're spending 199.9% of your income on, goods and services just to keep yourself going, you are more punished by GST than someone who happens to be saving 60% of their income. So, how do we solve this issue of making it fair? Because people try. I don't know if they've achieved it.
That's a fair question. I think there's something that gets missed in the debate a lot. And there was actually a New Zealand economist who went to the OECD that wrote about this very extensively. Someone who saves a lot now, the value of that savings is what they can consume in the future. So if you're taxing consumption, they will be taxed in the future, and that value of that savings is actually lower. So they do get captured in that net, but it's at a different point in time. When you take into account how people spend over their life cycles, so when they're young, they'll borrow, when they're older, they'll just save, and they're saving very much through the middle of their life, you actually find that GST is fairly neutral. Some of the exemptions associated with the way we do GST does mean the very top of the income distribution can have slightly lower rates. But if that's the case, you could ask yourself, should we switch the GST to a destination basis rather than an origin basis? Should we include some of those things? And is it the GST's role to deal with that distribution? If we are concerned people are over accumulating wealth, if we have a situation where we have inequity because of a lack of progressivity, then you need progressive income taxes, potentially the administration of a type of wealth tax.
Yes, now, this makes it very topical and interesting. And let's look at the Australian situation because there's debates over there as well. They have the compulsory superannuation scheme, which is up, I think, to 12%. That's right, 12% contribution from the employers and 12% from the employees, or is it half and half? I can't.
It's 12.5% in total.
12.5% in total. Woof, that's fantastic. Who's going to come home from Australia with that? But anyway, 12.5%. So that's a chunky thing. And actually, of course, that isn't taxed, the 12.5% you go in with. So if you are rich and you are socking aside, hundreds of thousands of dollars a year, you're getting the benefit of a big old, tax break from the government. When someone on the bones of their ass who's spending 100% of their income isn't getting nearly the same effect. And there's a lot of grumpiness in Australia about this. It seems like a tax break for rich people. And, the current Labor government in Australia is trying to tweak it here and there and getting lots of blowback. But what's your view on this issue of a wealth tax, land tax, capital taxes, capital gains tax? In Australia, they have a capital gains tax, although there's a bit of a discount if you've got your own homes. So tell us, what do you reckon? What's the best way to tax wealth or capital gains?
So I think the way to do this is to sit back and say, imagine you earned $1. So you give up some of your time and you receive $1. Ultimately, what we're thinking about is you might use that dollar later, and that's when you have savings and you build up wealth, and that dollar generates some income. So if you tax consumption, you're taxing it at the end when you consume it. If you tax your payroll, you're taxing at the start. If you tax the income, you're taxing both at the start and as it accumulates. So if there's inflation, you're taxing that inflation. And that means that you actually end up taxing more than you would if you had taxed consumption itself. Now, this is why people get a bit nervous about what's called capital taxes, as they're concerned about that inflation component. But there's another part to the income you get from capital, which is you may get a rent. You may be getting greater earnings than you need to compensate for inflation and for holding that money. Now, a GST is nice compared to a payroll tax because it captures those rents. A GST is a one-off wealth tax. So if we're worried about intergenerational inequity, it deals with it. It taxes the rents that are earned by these high-performing companies when they're doing things. It captures a lot of very progressive things. Now, we might say we're not interested in a one-off wealth tax. We want it to be continuous because we're worried about an accumulation of wealth. That's actually a very different type of argument, and it's administratively difficult. But if we do have a world of increasing wealth inequality, it's something we should consider.
Yeah, I'm interested in this idea that, GST is sort of it covers things. New Zealand's got a notoriously or famously, brilliantly or dastardly a situation of taxing just about everything, but it doesn't tax everything. So financial services, particularly, interest costs aren't covered by GST. I've always wondered about that. And also, of course, rents on residential properties and commercial properties from memory. So why isn't, services income, if you like, from property and services income from capital interest dividends? Why isn't that? Why don't you have GST on that too?
That's a great question. So that comes up a lot. And the idea is that those aren't really final consumption items. 96% of final consumption in New Zealand is taxed under a GST, compared to 50% in Australia and about 58% average across the OECD. So we do have very wide coverage, but with a lot of these things, either the item just beforehand is taxed by GST, or they are of the nature of capital income. So with a financial transaction, you actually have just this very tiny margin that's taxed as income. and there's no consumption happening there. The example I'll use is, imagine you've got health insurance. The health you're consuming gets taxed as consumption, but the levy you're paying for the insurance that will pay for that is not. If we tax both, we'll be taxing that consumption twice. And that's the nature for why a lot of these things get excluded. But we should be aware that if we excluded another part of it, so if we didn't tax a new build in terms of GST anymore, that would create a giant gap in our tax base.
But what about rents on residential property?
So a rent on residential property, the rationale back in the day was that we're not taxing the consumption associated with you owning your own house, other than when it was initially built. So we want to treat that, and we want to treat when the property is rented out the same way. So for that reason, you end up with an exclusion, because if it was included, they would want to tax your imputed rent. Now, there might be very, very good reasons for taxing imputed rent. And I've heard economists such as, it would have been Jeff Simmons, mentioning that this was a reasonable idea and something we could incorporate in the system. So if you did that, that would then open the door for taxing rent as well. But it's always these things about, can we treat things consistently? And if we imagine a value chain, when has the tax stopped? Because it's that end bit we're not taxing. The rest has been.
So we don't have a capital gains tax in New Zealand. We're pretty much the only place in the world that we'd compare ourselves with that doesn't. And ironically, yesterday, the ANZ Group chief economist, Richard Yetzinger, came over to Wellington and mentioned at the big infrastructure conference, probably a good idea to have one. I'm surprised he wasn't sort of dragged out and strung up by someone. But anyway, he said it. What's your view on a capital gains tax versus, let's say, a wealth tax, like the one that Grant Robertson and David Parker were about to do in budget 2023, but Chris Hipkins bailed out and threw it onto the bonfire?
So if we start with just the capital gains tax, a capital gain is a form of income, just like anything else. But if we go back to that example, part of capital income is just our return for inflation. So part of that capital gain is a return to inflation. A lot of countries discount capital gains because they're concerned about taxing that. But if you feel that way, don't tax that on interest income. Don't tax that on dividends. The fact we do that, but we don't do it on capital gains, is an inconsistency, and it's a big problem. Now, my view when I was doing tax things in New Zealand was remove it from everything. And people like Andrew Coleman felt that way as well. When the view of
remove capital gains tax from everything. So,
for example, remove the inflation part of all these things.
So for example, when people get paid interest on their term deposit, there's a withholding tax. Yeah,
exactly. So there's debates about what you do there and what's sort of the right thing to do, but we should be treating these capital items the same way. And E61 actually recently has a note talking about how to look at effective tax rates across the income distribution when you include these gains and treat capital the same way. And we show that it creates a lot of variability. And this is based on work from the New Zealand Treasury by Ben Ching, where a much more complex bases of income were evaluated and looked at. And it's really great work. Both IRD and Treasury did great work there. Now, with a wealth tax, the key thing there is, so what gets tricky is, a wealth tax is essentially only taxing that normal rate of return that people get, the inflation component and what you need to hold it. The rents people earn are no longer being taxed. So a wealth tax and a capital tax, so capital gains, interest, dividends, are the same thing, unless companies are earning extra profits and they can't capitalize them in the asset price. So if we want to capture those extra profits, we actually want to tax capital income properly rather than wealth. So wealth tax sounds nice. And, if we're concerned about progressivity, it can help if you can administer it properly, which is always a big question. But getting your capital income right and having a core argument for that, and making sure you capture those rents, which aren't distortive, they don't change behavior. That's how you get an efficient tax base. That's how you raise the revenue we need for fiscal sustainability.
But often when people talk about a capital gains tax, they always exclude the family home. Politicians do, at least. That still leaves this massive gap for people to pump all of their savings into capital gains on the residential home. hopefully the one they live in, because there's a bunch of people who will have 2 or 3 homes they might live in for a few weeks every year. What do you think of that thing? If we're going to do a capital gains tax, should it include the family home?
Yeah, yeah, definitely. The thing is, if you include the family home and you tax that flow, the fact you own a home and you're earning a rent, you also need to allow people to deduct interest. You need to allow people to deduct expenses because that's the real income there. So that all makes sense in principle, but there's a reason people feel uncomfortable with it. And ultimately, that's where we start making these trade offs from a pure tax system, which, as an economist, I'm not the best person to deal with because I barely have human emotions in that.
Mate, thank you very much. That's fantastic, Matt. I really enjoyed that chat. A good lap around the tax theory traps. I'm sure there's more we can talk about. I'd love to do that again. Matt Nolan, who has a fantastic Substack, a New Zealander in Australia. There's not many of those. And we'd love to have you on again. Matt Nolan there. I'm Bernard Hickey for the Kaka. That was a mini-hoon. Ka kite anō.